One of my favorite videos in this little project so far concerned the two courts era of Japanese history, when two different emperors claimed they were the real one and the other was an imposter. I covered that situation up to the point when the Southern Court reconciled with the Northern Court, plus a brief present-day coda. There was more to the story, but I cut it off at that point, largely because what came next seemed really difficult. But the story stuck with me, and a few days into the new year, I took a trip up into the mountains of Yoshino to trace what history calls the later Southern Court. This has probably been the subject I've had the most trouble researching. Records of the later Southern Court are spotty at best, familial links are uncertain, and everyone has multiple names. A helpful clerk at a rest stop gave me some information that was completely contradicted by a pamphlet from that same rest stop. And an old man I met during my journey told me something that, if true, would rewrite the past 500 years of imperial history. I've tried to make my chronicle as tidy as possible, but there's still some dirt around the edges. As we head west into Yoshino, I'll recap my first video on the subject. I'd recommend you go back and watch that one too, though. In 1337, that most late of years, the Emperor Go-Daigo found himself at odds with his shogun, Ashikaga Takeuji. The shogun arrested the emperor and placed a cousin of Go-Daigo's on the throne. Go-Daigo escaped and set up a court in exile in rural Yoshino, and the descendants of both emperors continued acting as if they were the one true sovereign of Japan. After intermittent skirmishes, the situation was resolved peaceably in 1392, with both courts agreeing to alternate control of the throne. That's where we ended last time, with the Southern Court essentially folded into the Northern one. Our first stop today is Kitayama Shrine. Kitayama Shrine is built on the site of the Southern Court Palace, or a Southern Court Palace, or maybe not. There's going to be a lot of uncertainty going forward. Whatever it once was, Kitayama Shrine commemorates the bloodline of the final Southern Court Emperor, Go-Kameyama. He abdicated under the agreement that his son would become emperor after the current Northern Court Emperor retired. However, while the Northern Court had spent the past 50 years forging close bonds with the ruling clan, the Southern Court had been hiding out here, 2 hours from the nearest city by car, and who knows how long on foot. So when the Emperor reneged on the agreement, the shogunate was unwilling to enforce the treaty. The outraged Go-Kameyama fled south to Ise. There, he forged an alliance with Southern Court loyalists. An army was raised, and promptly defeated by government forces. The ex-emperor returned meekly to Kyoto, where he became a monk at a Buddhist temple. Just down the road from Kitayama Shrine is Ryusenji Temple, which would have belonged to the palace complex, if indeed this is where the palace was. Go-Kameyama's descendants kept living at the palace and made trouble for the authorities around Yoshino. A grandson, Yasuhito, made another push to become the emperor in 1428. Emperor Shoko had just died at the age of 27 without any sons. This was the chance for the Southern dynasty to ascend. Surely this time they were going to let him kick that football. Shockingly, the shogun installed a cousin of the deceased emperor instead of the guy who had been fighting against him for the past decade. Like his grandfather, Yasuhito fled the capital. Like his grandfather, he built a coalition of Southern Court sympathizers. This army fared better than the last one, but it too was defeated. And like his grandfather, Yasuhito returned to Kyoto in disgrace. In a masterful display of failing upwards, the shogunate agreed to give Yasuhito a monthly stipend on the condition that he and his son enter the priesthood and generally stop committing insurrections. Yasuhito agreed, thereby ending the Southern Court dynasty once and for all. I'm joking, of course, but the next claimant does require a little detour. In the town of Yuasa, there's a forlorn little shrine tucked away behind some fields. Though quiet nowadays, in 1446 this was a battleground. A distant cousin of Yasuhito's by the name of Yoshiari had rounded up a few thousand soldiers in yet another doomed quest to ascend the throne. It seems remarkably easy to declare yourself emperor and get countless soldiers to flock to your side, and maybe it is, I've never tried it. For a few years, the band harassed the shogun's forces, but eventually they found themselves backed into a siege at Yuasa Castle. The castle was overrun, and Emperor Yoshiari retreated to what is now the shrine, where he fell on his sword. The locals, sympathetic to Yoshiari's claims, gave the would-be emperor a royal burial. Yoshiari's grave came to be known as the Forbidden Woods. Although there's very little woods left today, the trees around the memorial remain. Let's return to Yoshino. Next up is Kongoji Temple, another site associated with the later Southern Court. Appropriately, our next candidate for the throne was himself a Zen Buddhist monk, and he's only known by his Buddhist name Konzosu. Konzosu was probably the grandnephew of Emperor Go-Kameyama, and from here on out probably is as good as it's going to get. The monk put together an ambitious scheme to assassinate the emperor. Konzosu was perhaps under the assumption that if you kill the emperor, you gain his powers, like Mega Man. The assassins broke into the emperor's quarters at the imperial palace in Kyoto to find them empty. The emperor had been rushed to safety only moments earlier. Before Konzosu escaped the palace himself, he directed his men to steal 2 of Japan's 3 imperial treasures. Exactly what the imperial treasures are is beyond the scope of this video, but for the moment, let's just say this was a massive blow to the imperial family. The Zen monks and their few hundred allies retreated east to Ennyakuji Monastery atop Mount Hiei. They held off shogunate forces for a few days before being overcome. Konzosu died in the fighting, and the would-be emperor's conspirators were executed. Konzosu's 3-year-old son became the next southern emperor, and the young ruler was beloved by the people of Kitayama village, as attested by the many, many sites in Yoshino which purport to be his grave. The emperor was 16 when he was killed in a raid on the Southern Court Palace to recover the last of the 3 imperial treasures. It's very difficult to tell what happened to the Southern Court after the so-called Emperor of Kitayama. In some cases, the evidence has literally been washed away. The next emperor, the son of the doomed Yoshiari from earlier, fought and possibly died in a battle here hoping to avenge his cousin. But today, the battlefield lies deep underwater, the victim of a dam. The final later Southern Emperor doesn't even have a name. He's referred to as the Western Army Emperor because he fought on the side of the Western Army in the Onin War around 1470. It's thought that he wanted to use his military support as leverage for a shot at the throne, but when that seemed unlikely, he vanished from the army, and from the pages of history. It's immediately and tragically obvious that not one of the would-be emperors we've talked about today ever had a shot at the throne. The early Southern Court only became legitimate through a quirk of history 500 years after they were all dead. With the later Southern Court emperors, no decisions they could have made in their lives would have put them on the throne. Their chance of becoming Emperor of Japan was just slightly higher than mine is. They wanted to be emperor in the way that a child wants to be an astronaut, except that wanting to go to space doesn't kill hundreds or thousands of people. And the thing is, I have to believe they realized this. You've all seen where the Southern Court emperors made their home. It's not exactly a bustling metropolis. Anytime they stepped outside the front door, the very environment should have been screaming at them to put aside this quixotic errand and enjoy your comparatively high station. And instead, they spent their days tossing soldiers' lives into a meat grinder until they got too close and fell in themselves. Victims to a crusade so futile that some of their names have been forgotten by history. Even in the dead of winter, Yoshino is a beautiful place. But it's muddied by the footprints of the stupid, callous, pitiable men who dreamed one day of power.